On this episode of the High Quality Fun podcast, we talked to Jarrett, who served in the Peace Corps for over 3 years in both Guatemala and Colombia. Jarrett tells us about his time serving in these povern villages and the work he did. I came into this episode completely blind and learned a ton about what the Peace Corps is, and I left feeling incredibly fortunate that all my basic needs are covered. This episode was humbling, fun, and ended with a tangent about how the progression of this podcast is going. Stay tuned, and I hope you enjoy.
Thanks for having me on. I've seen a couple of the episodes, and I've kind of scrubbed through and bits and pieces, and it's like a lot of road trips. I got to say, I'm really inspired to like do a road trip. I'm normally in my life just kind of jet setting, and then I go to a place and I stay for a while, but like I do know I need to do more road trips, especially domestically in the States. And so listening to some of your stories has been kind of eye-opening. And I know that you also just throw the family in the car and go for 16, 18 hours just because you want to see somebody you haven't seen. So that's inspiring for me. So yeah, great to be here. Let's talk about Peace Corps. I don't think I've ever actually publicly talked about Peace Corps as I'm about to now, which is kind of interesting. So that's why I was super pumped to do it. And thank you for the space. I joined the Peace Corps in January, a date I'll never forget, January 6, 2010. I was 22 years old, and I met a bunch of people on January 5th in Washington, D.C. in a conference room. And the next day we all flew down and we went to Guatemala. And I was in Guatemala for 26 months, left the Peace Corps, finished up my service, came back to the United States, was home for about 3 months, and it ended a relationship, kind of had like a big moment where I was like, what am I doing? The U.S. doesn't feel right, kind of freaked out, and then rejoined the Peace Corps and did another year. You could basically extend at that point to do another year as long as you were able to go through the process. And basically a country and a program was a good fit and they wanted you. So then I did another year in Colombia. So 26 months in Guatemala and then 12 months in Colombia, where I'm actually currently living. And so that's kind of like my history. And now I don't know how much you want me to, should I give the background on like what the Peace Corps is and why it exists?
That was going to be my next question. I purposely did not dive into like what the Peace Corps is because I'm coming to this pretty blind, and I like that. I think that the listeners enjoy that too. But I know it's just, volunteering around the world to help out with stuff, but I don't know much about it. So yeah, why don't you give the low level or high level explanation?
Sure. And like a lot of people still don't know a lot about the Peace Corps. And it's interesting because it's a pretty big thing as far as it was started in 1961 by John F. Kennedy. And if you think back to 1961, things are pretty rough with the Cold War. He will be assassinated 2 years later in 1963. And in and around that time, there's just like what's going on with Cuba, the Russians putting missiles on Cuba to get them closer to our borders. It's a pretty uncomfortable geopolitical time, honestly, not unlike the world we live in now with Ukraine and Russia, and we have what's going on with the Middle East. So it was a very uncertain time. And in that time, he created the Peace Corps by executive order to basically provide the world support vis-a-vis America and the power that it is through kind of soft diplomacy, if that makes sense. I'm not sure if that's actually the technical term. I studied all this, but I don't remember any of it now. But I believe it's called soft diplomacy. And then hard diplomacy is the military, right? So that's why it has a core to it. Just like the Marine Corps, it's the Peace Corps. And the idea was essentially that let's send Americans or U.S. citizens around the world. And the Peace Corps has 3 goals. And hopefully I remember them because now I'm on camera. But they are to go and bring a skill, bring a talent to a far off place to basically add value, whatever that looks like. And then the other 2 are great because they're nothing to do with work. One of them is to bring your culture, wherever you are from in the States, bring that to the place where you're going to go work. And then the third one, which is probably the one that I still live out daily, is when you return from said place, whatever that place is in the world, that you bring that culture with you back to your home and you talk about that. The idea is then to make it kind of kumbaya, right? I mean, this is in the time of, it would eventually be the anti-war as the Vietnam War would go. But like Peace Corps really founded in a time of peace and love and hippies, right? Like we can all get along on this planet, right? So, and the third one, yeah, like I said, being, I'm going to take information and what I've learned and all the cultural values and all of this stuff in my experience and make the world a little bit smaller. Because if we all know someone, I mean, this is just, if we all knew, I think Trevor Noah talks about this, but he's like, there's so much hate and diversion and division in life because we all just don't know enough people from enough disparate places, right? And so I think the Peace Corps was John F. Kennedy's attempt to kind of say, hey, America can do good in the world. Not that our military doesn't do good on some level, but I think when you walk into a village with a gun in your hand, it's different than when you walk in and you're just trying to help people, get a roof on the school or try to get a water project there. So that's kind of like the background of the Peace Corps. And I love it because this is one of the things I love about the Peace Corps. I'm sure you're going to ask me this, so I'm sorry I'm jumping ahead. But I always tell people when I was in the Peace Corps, they say you're on 24 hours a day, because of those last two items, right? So you bring the skill. So maybe that's something that you would do during the day, but then like diving into culture is another third of your job. And then learning really important things that then you get to take home or even share with people. When for me in the Peace Corps, I would use Skype, right? But now people probably FaceTime volunteers. So the point being that 66% of the time I was there, it wasn't necessarily focused around my work in air quotes. It was focused around my kind of cultural immersion and cultural exchange.
You were mentioning like soft diplomacy and hard diplomacy. Would you consider, since it's core, the Marine Corps is a soft diplomacy thing? Because I don't know. Like I assume that that's all hard diplomacy, and you're kind of comparing those together.
Yeah. I mean, that's where the soft is like USAID money that we send around the world, right? And then the hard is when we put boots on the ground and we need to push people that way. Soft diplomacy could be like, sanctions, right? If we're going to sanction a country, that's like, hey, we don't want to get, we don't want to have bloodshed, but this is kind of what we want to do. We think it would be better if you kind of did this. And obviously the United States is the power,
powerhouse.
Right? Yeah, kind of like the police, right? We're kind of like the international police, and we step in when we feel like there's something that could happen that could change the current balance where that keeps us on the top of the hill type thing. So Peace Corps would be kind of more of a part of a soft diplomacy as opposed to something that's getting ever close, I would say, to violence or even the threat of violence, right? And I think that this is an interesting thing because being in the Peace Corps, I was totally a government employee. I was by extension, a government employee. I'm currently abroad and I currently live in Colombia. And let's just say something bad happens to me. Okay. This is just like an example of how big the Peace Corps is. Something bad happens to me here and I end up dying. I'm in a car crash and I end up dying. Life happens. Okay. I would not be on the CNN ticker as a US citizen because there's so many other bigger things happening internationally. However, if a Peace Corps volunteer dies in their service, that will probably be on the CNN ticker because it is a huge deal. It's part of our diplomatic, international kind of reach that we have around the world. And so it is interesting to think of it that way. And in that sense, the Peace Corps is a big deal. And I don't have the numbers on me and I wish I did, but you can probably Google or we could even ChatGPT it. But we're talking probably hundreds of thousands of people have been volunteers in the Peace Corps since the 60s. And so it's a kind of like an elephant in the room. And there's a lot of people in Washington. There's a lot of politicians and people in Washington who have served in the Peace Corps. Part of that is because when they come back, there's actually one of the pluses of the Peace Corps. When you come back, you get NCE, which is non-competitive eligibility, which says, okay, Tyler, you served in Honduras for 2 years. You were working in a WASH program, a water and sanitation and hygiene program. And then you come back and you want to continue working in whatever, but something in the government, for example. Because you were in the Peace Corps, and I'm sure the military must have something similar, but because you were in the Peace Corps, you get non-competitive eligibility. This means that when Tyler puts his resume into the pile of wanting to work in the energy sector for the government, for example, you would get to the top. You basically get put to the front of the line and they review that first. And so a lot of people, when they leave Peace Corps, because of the NCE, you have it for 2 years, they go to DC or they look to get that federal job, and most federal jobs are in DC. So point being, there's a lot of people within our political on both sides of the aisle who have served in the Peace Corps.
Okay. And how did you make where were you living at the time? And how did you kind of hear about this and decide that this is what you wanted to do over the next 2 years? You said 2 years, right?
Yeah, 2 years. So a normal typical service is 27 months, 3 months of training, and then 2 years of service, 27 months. So I'm kind of an exception maybe for some people, but I'm a legacy. My father did the Peace Corps in Bolivia in the 70s. And so since I was a kid, I'd heard his stories. I'd met friends that he had in the Peace Corps. I'd seen what that community meant for him, even as an adult. And so I had decided by the time I was like in middle school, I was like, I want to do the Peace Corps. Like that is something I want to do. I know, I think one of the things about being in your 20s, and I don't think either of us are in our 20s. Are you in your 20s? I know I'm outing your age on your podcast here.
I'm 32 right now.
Okay. But, in your 20s, when your best friend says to you, hey, I'm going to go to this part of the world for 2 years, I'll see you. It was like the end of days. Even though now we look back and it's like, man, 2 years in your 20s, you got to do that. That's so great. So at the time, it wasn't maybe something that I think some of my friends were as excited about. And I also didn't maybe necessarily want to leave my social circle where it was at that time. But I did. But to go to your question, I've known since I was probably middle school or high school that I wanted to do the Peace Corps after college. I just like, after college, that's going to be my thing. I'll do that. And then I'll have the rest of my life to figure out, making money and doing whatever else we're supposed to do in this world. So, yeah.
Man, I was going to even draw the parallel. Like you go to college after high school and that's an escape. That's a new experience. Half the time you go for that, but you went to college and then went out to the Peace Corps. Kind of got both before you had to really hunker down and figure out what you wanted to do with your life. Let's take a quick break and hear from our sponsors. Here on the High Quality Fun podcast, we love showcasing people's stories through our interviews and posts. This gives our guests the opportunity to share their favorite memories, but sometimes audio alone is not enough. Most people are sitting on a collection of hundreds of photos and videos capturing their favorite moments without the time or experience needed to compile these memories into a video. This is why I have chosen to partner with Spivo. Simply send them your unsorted photos and videos, and in 7 days or less, they will create a professional video edit that allows you to relive your favorite memories again and again. To ensure every customer is satisfied with their video edit, Spivo provides unlimited revisions for 30 days and offers a 100% money-back satisfaction guarantee. As someone who has limited time to edit his family adventures, let alone this podcast, I am excited to work with Spivo to help everyone eternalize their favorite moments. Visit spivo.com/discount/high-quality-fun to learn more and let us know what you think about the product. We'd love to share it. Now, back to the show. When you did this, so your first round was in Guatemala, was there like an overall goal for you and your unit? I don't know what to call it when you're down there, or are you just kind of showing up and living amongst the people to instill our values on them?
Yeah, I think it's interesting when you're 20, no matter what you're doing, at least your 30-year-old self, looking back at your 20-year-old self, you were jaded, right? You just didn't know it. Or sorry, you weren't jaded, and then you would be jaded because when you're 20, everyone thinks whatever their goal is, they assume it's going to happen in much quicker timelines than you assume. Whether that's, I'm going to be a millionaire, I'm going to get a Lamborghini, or I'm going to get a house, or I'm going to get married and have 3 kids, or you move to a different country, you join the Peace Corps, and you come to a place and you're like, okay, they need water. Let me help them get that in 3 months, right? All your expectations are just thrown out the window when you join the Peace Corps because I'll speak in the context of Guatemala. Guatemala is a country that is, I think, the second poorest in our hemisphere besides Haiti. And so with that much poverty, there's a lot of need. And Guatemala is a place where there's a lot of people who go down, a lot of missionary work, a lot of people who even come down for a week and they do Habitat for Humanity type stuff. But the reality of it is change takes a really, really long time. And when you have a serious issue where you have malnutrition or you just have a community that just doesn't even have water, it takes a long time to fix. So even though you come in and you have your college degree from another country and whatever, it takes a long time. And this isn't something that's apparent. And honestly, maybe until you do it. And like when I think of the US, like I don't even know if Flint has drinking water, and that's been a decade, So like getting certain, especially infrastructure projects on or solving inequalities across society that affect people, there's just no easy answers. And the second you kind of think there is, it gets difficult. And if there is an easy answer, the easiest answer probably is the one that takes the longest, right? Which is really, really hard to sometimes wrap your head around. In the US, it could be people living on the streets. There are other countries in the world where there's just not the people experiencing homeless levels that we have in the US. And so they'd come over and be like, oh, this is an easy fix. And then they realize, it's tied into local politics. It's tied into local budgets. Is it federal? Is it state? Is it municipal? Right? So nothing's ever easy. And I think the easier something looks, especially in international development, when you walk into the situation, more often than not, the more like levels of the Shrek onion there are that you're going to have to peel back. So I think when I got there, I had certain goals. Personally, I wanted to improve my Spanish. At that time, my Spanish was pretty rough relatively. I could communicate, but it wasn't where it is now. And I wanted to be as present as possible. At this time, I mean, it was 2010, man. Like I had a T9 cell phone, right? And I think because I was in the Peace Corps from 2010 to 2013, I came out and the world was moving 1,000 miles per hour, right? All of a sudden, everyone had a smartphone. Uber had dropped. Twitter was a thing. Instagram was a thing. You could FaceTime. All of these things didn't exist. I was going from T9, so like, I don't know. I'm kind of getting away from your question here, but I think my goal there was to just kind of be present and go with the flow. I ended up doing some cool projects, and if I had told if like the Ghost of Christmas Past had been like, hey, you're only going to do these 2 or 3 projects, I'd be like, oh man, that's a failure. But then when you get into it, it's like, holy crap. Doing those 2 or 3 projects was for me building like my own, pyramids of Giza over 2 years. So yeah.
What were those projects? My original question was, what was the goal of the Peace Corps going there? But I mean, hearing why you did it is excellent. Like that, you want the new adventure, you want to learn Spanish and experience a new culture. But was there assigned projects that you guys went down there to work on?
Yeah, I got you. So, and also I would say, so there's the 3 overarching goals of the Peace Corps, just as like a unit out in the world, which, as I've said, are, bring a skill, basically bring value into community and see if that value can, support whatever they're doing, even by moving one grain of sand to the other. And then the other 2 are just cultural immersions, right? But one of the things for me personally also was I graduated with a Latin American studies degree, because basically I wanted to be a history major and I was studying history, and then I just realized I didn't care about the Ming Dynasty. Now I think it's kind of fascinating. But when I was 18, 19, I was like, I'd much rather focus on like this part of the world, the Americas and that. And so I graduated with this degree, this Bachelor's of Arts. And when you graduate college, at least back then, I feel like there's a mixed feeling of like, I can do anything, but also I can do nothing. Who's going to hire me? My resume is whatever. And also I graduated in May of 2009. We were the entire country's done, right? We are in the throes of the financial crisis. So for me, going down was also for me to kind of validate my experience, my theoretical understanding of the region with some more practical, like, oh, this is how this stuff works. This is how like society works. This is how culture is in Latin America. And then where I was in a program called Healthy Schools. And if any one of my people who serve with me are watching this is going to be wild, but we went down and we had all these grand objectives with Healthy Schools, but essentially we were there to support within the school system. It was a training of teachers, TOTS. It was a TOTS program, which is like, I could go into a school for 2 years and teach Profe Tyler's 20 kids to do 2 things. These were the 2 things that we were trying to get them to do: brush their teeth and wash their hands. But the system that had been created before I got there was that I would go into Profe Tyler's classroom for 10 minutes a week while I was visiting the school where maybe you work at. So I would work with you to try to share some tools so that way you could get the kids, when I'm not there, to brush their teeth and wash their hands. So that's really it. And I know that sounds super basic for us, but in many different cultures, that may not be something that, like, you have kids, right? So you've taught them from a young age, I'm assuming, that when they go to the bathroom and they do their necessities, then they wash their hands, because maybe they're probably going to go eat. The amount of times that we go to the bathroom while we're eating is actually remarkable. And maybe you've never thought about it, but now you will every time maybe you do it. And so we were really sent down there, the 45 of us, 22 of us, maybe it's kind of split in 2. We're really focused on this program called Healthy Schools, where basically I would go give mini TEDx's every week at a different school to different teachers on, different ways to kind of incentivize behavior change. Because if you've never been told to wash your hands before, after you eat, after you go to the bathroom and before you eat, and then the idea just of brushing your teeth, these are really foreign concepts. Yeah.
I'm trying to think, was it like post-Renaissance era where sanitation started to like catch up and people started to realize how important it was to actually be clean for like longevity and everything?
Yeah, I'm not sure, but that's interesting you bring that up because I was at a winery called Bull Run Winery, and I know you and I are in Bitcoin. I guess we'll just say that and then leave it. But I was at Bull Run Winery in Virginia in 2017, 2018, and they had like a tour where they would give you the tour around the winery to like show you stuff. And they had this one thing where they were talking about the Civil War because in the Bull Run there was a battle of Bull Run. It was quasi famous. And they were saying that it was during the Civil War. So I think cleanliness definitely like post-Renaissance for hundreds of years had been important. Like, yeah, you want to be quasi clean. You know, the idea of being a knight and showering once a year. Like maybe we need to, you know, step that up a little bit. I can't even imagine what that'd be like. But it was in the Civil War when they totally understood, hey, if you and I are fighting and then we set up our tent at night, we can't just like hook over the fire on this side of the tent and then dig a hole in the ground on the other side of the tent. That idea of separation of like, you know, where you eat and where you do your necessities, that apparently became really front and center in and around the time of the Civil War. So it's still a generally new concept if we think that like humans have been around for thousands of years, that like we need to separate where we eat and where we poop and pee, but also that like the idea of washing our hands after we do either of those two. I think those are fairly new concepts. And one of the things that I'll say about the experience is, you know, if I tell you, Tyler, okay, you have to go to a school and you have to teach these two things, that's it. There's probably the assumption that there's going to be water. And at many of the schools I went to, there was no water. So how do you teach those two things without water? That was like, okay. And that goes into some of the projects I did. Yeah.
So not only are you, I'm imagining that these are, you know, the poorest areas in the world and they don't have the infrastructure as you just led on to believe or led on to, and they're, you know, they may not have the technology to, or the advancements to even know that post Civil War over here in America, we were seeing the importance of washing your hands and everything. So yeah, why don't we go into those projects and, you know, I guess the journey to kind of get them to wash your hands, brush your teeth.
Yeah, sure. And I have to say too, Guatemala is a very interesting place. It has Guatemala City, which is, you know, if you and I go, there's probably nothing in the States that you can't not get there. Like it's a big city. It's bustling, right? And like the habits that are there are different than the ones where I lived, where I was out in the middle of nowhere, living in communities where when I got there, they didn't have any electricity or water. So just night and day. And that's just like I would say the juxtaposition between the city life in Guatemala, where sometimes I would be where the Peace Corps office was kind of near, to where I would be working and supporting these communities was, I don't even know. It'd be like New York City to you and I, like ranching in the middle of Wyoming, and we're trying to figure out how we do it without electricity and water, right? And that happens.
I remember when I was younger, I did blanking on the name. I went out to West Virginia with my church to work for a month, and yeah, I just totally blind to the world, hadn't traveled at that point. Everything was here at home, and I went out there, and they had power, but like the nearest city was nowhere. I'm trying to remember where we even stayed. It might have just been tents. But yeah, we went out there to like build houses or improve houses that people lived in out there. And it was just such a grounding experience to see the juxtaposition between what I'm used to and you know, what I'm not used to within the States even. And now you're getting that amongst a different country, a different continent.
Yeah. And so exactly that. And so Guatemala is the size of Pennsylvania. So, and maybe Pennsylvania could be a good example. I've driven through parts of Pennsylvania that used to be coal country, and they're pretty depressed economically now. But yeah, it'd be like being downtown Philly and then driving 3 hours out into the outskirts, but then having also no electricity and water. And so that's just like, okay, how do we start to do this? So I think you asked about the projects I was able to do, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, so because most of my work was basically around kind of WASH is what you'd say, international development, which is water and sanitation and hygiene. I did 2 or 3, gosh, I'd have to look at pictures, 2 or 3 water projects. And they were this simple. They were getting basically long PVC pipes out to these communities, which I know sounds easy, but then when you have to get them out there, and there's some of them, there's no roads, like it's literally walking through the wilderness. So you'd get a long PVC pipe, and they have a corrugated tin roof, which hopefully people can kind of imagine. But a corrugated tin roof kind of looks like a piece of manicotti pasta. I'm not even sure if that's the right pasta. Italians may correct me here. So you have the roof here, okay? And the water will come down, and it rains a lot. So Guatemala has a rainy season. And then basically you get this PVC pipe, and you would saw it in half, take it, and you just put it on like that, right? So now you have this like gutter that you've kind of created out of nothing. And this is all over Guatemala and all over many parts of the world, because it's just the easiest way to create a gutter. So then when the rain comes, it would hit this gutter system, and the gutter more often than not had, so you have this, and I need more hands, but you would have a wire that would go around the PVC pipe to kind of hold it in place, and then that water would basically be put into a tank that we would go out and build, and then the tank would hold the water, and then just by gravity, in the bottom, it would be a circular tank, and all around the bottom, this is kind of like old school, the ones we had in public school in Mass. I don't know if people had them. There would be washing stations where you could wash your hands or brush your teeth. And you would just kind of, turn the faucet and the water would come out. And that's really, we did 3 of those. And then I built one thing, which was there was a bathroom that was built, and we can get into like best practices in international development here. But there was a bathroom that was built by a Spanish NGO in the early 2000s. So this must have been 10 years before I got there. And it was a full working bathroom. Like the toilets you have in your house, the toilets I have here in where I'm living, we'll call them, developed nation toilets, for example, because toilet tech around the world is different. And you'll see that as you travel. So they had these, with the plungers and the tanks, and just like the toilets you have if you're listening in the United States. The problem was the septic system that they had created, the septic tank, basically stopped working. And then no one wants to use the toilets. And I can talk more about toilets if it's interesting, because it kind of talks about, changes in cultural perception. So what I did was, this school is kind of on a hill. So what we did was we designed a whole new system, so that way the toilets could be used, that would basically draw from the current septic system, draw that sludge, I guess I'm trying to be as diplomatic as possible on this podcast, down a hill and take it into a whole new system to basically clear out that septic tank and make it so that way they could use it again. And that was building a trench down a hill of maybe 200 meters down a hill into a huge, then, I don't know, 3 meters. So what's that, like 10 to 12 feet deep by probably 6 feet wide cylinder that was then, concreted out. And that would basically be the new septic tank. Anyways, that's a long way to say we got some toilets running, and we got people some water so they could start to practice their habits. Yeah.
If they didn't have electricity, they didn't have a water pump to fill those. So was it like a hand filled toilet?
Depending on how it works, some schools had electricity. That particular school had electricity.
Okay.
Ones that just got the runoff water, they didn't. So classes would.
It was just like constant input of water, and then it would drain when you flushed it.
Yeah, and then it went into So wait, the hand sinks, or the lavamanos, God, I can't think of the word. Yeah, the hand sinks. I don't know if that's right. They would just go out into a I'm blanking on all these words, these technical terms now, but into a field where is it a leaching field? Septic field. Yeah. Where we had created under the earth that had rocks that would like break it up. And the only thing there was like toothpaste and hand soap. So that was like, okay. And we tried to use the most organic stuff we could find. Cause like, if you need to make toothpaste and you're in a pinch, like baking soda and drops of mint go a real long way. They're going to do most of what you got. Now, I know when you and I go to CVS or any store in the States, they've got like a billion different types, but basically. And then, yeah, the other one, they did have electricity. That's a great call. They did have electricity. Yeah.
Okay. So was the experience between Guatemala and Colombia similar? You're doing the same type of mission, same type of jobs, just different country?
So they're completely different, and this is a phenomenal question because they're completely different. So in Guatemala, I was in a place where I lived was it's on the Mexican border, and where I worked, high poverty levels. Like kids were stunted, and I'd never seen that before. And stunting is when you literally you'll find grown men that were 4'6", and it's because they didn't get the nutrition that they needed throughout the early parts of their lives to be able to basically grow, throughout puberty. They were starved of that much nutrition and that much sustenance, right? And so I was dealing with a certain type of malnutrition there, or a certain type of like bad health outcome in this schools program. And then when I went to Colombia, I was on the other side. I was up on the coast, and I was dealing with the other outcomes of bad health, which was obesity and diabetes, right? They had too much food. They were getting too much sugar. They were growing too big. And there I actually did one of the cooler things maybe I've ever done in my life, but I worked for a program called Football with Heart, or Soccer with Heart, where for half the time we would have local kids from the area. They would come in and we talk about life skills, all types of basically personal development stuff. And then the other half we'd play soccer. And the soccer was basically the calling card to get the kids to come play, to get the kids to come, then talk about, hey, maybe, it's okay to say no to gangs. It's okay to say no to drugs and alcohol. Even some like sexual education stuff, which is very important in many parts of the world where if that's just not present. I always say the more babies you see in the world, the less they talk about sexual education. Right. In America, you talk about sexual education a lot. So per family, the babies are like way down. So I did a completely different thing, but I basically played soccer on the coast and got to hang out with amazing staff and amazing kids for a year. Yeah.
Yeah, that's quite the different project. When you're down here in each country, where are you living? Are you living amongst the villages that you're serving, or are you driving in from the city every morning?
Yeah, so I'm living out there. And in both circumstances, I lived with a family. So as volunteers, you could choose to live by yourself, kind of like a lot of volunteers would live in what would be kind of like a pool house or a cabana house, which is just like an extra room that is honestly not too dissimilar from the room I'm currently in, which is like my office, where, I have a bed, right? I have a bathroom, which you can't see, which is out of shot. And, I could just set up a little kitchen, and there it is. Like, that's my house. But I lived with a family both times, and I really enjoyed those experiences, and I still keep in touch with both of those families. So yeah, and in both of those, the family here in Colombia, I had a room, and then the family in Guatemala, I had more of like an in-law, which was like 2 rooms. One was my bedroom, and then one was my kitchen. But I was still part of the family, I guess I'll call it a compound. It was a big building where, 15 people lived. So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess I kind of want to understand the culture shock that you had coming to each of these places, and then maybe how that changed over time. Did you even have culture shock the second time, or were you just fully expecting it? And then, I don't know, are there any particular stories that come to mind when you're thinking about your full time out here? Because I love diving into these high quality fun stories that are the ones that are the most memorable from your time there. I know that I asked like 3 questions there, but just tear it apart.
No, okay, yeah. I'll try to go. So this culture shock getting to Guatemala was pretty big. Guatemala is a place that is so beautiful. The people are so amazing, the nicest people. Like, they will go out of their way to give you, we say like the shirt off your back, we'll say that in the States. Like, they'll give you more, and they have less generally where I was living. So the culture shock was interesting because it's like, I think one of the things culturally, especially if you're from the States or spent any time in the States or even studied in the States, we're very punctual. And, if we hop on this podcast and either of us is going to be late, we're going to say, hey, I'm going to be like 5 minutes late, 10 minutes late. Is that cool? Like, we communicate that, right, out of respect for other people. And I always tell the story. I was giving a workshop from 8 a.m. to noon. And in order to get people to basically come to my workshops, I would have to give out a diploma. I would go print them out at like the local paper store and print them out and give them to like Tyler, thank you for coming to learn about how to wash your hands using this new technique or like whatever. And this woman showed up at 11:30. So old girl shows up 3.5 hours late and still wants a diploma because it's not an issue there. Time doesn't really exist. And so that was a very, very fascinating thing. And I still deal with it today living in Latin America, because different people take time differently. And so the concept of time was just completely different. Like you maybe heard the idea of like island time if you're in the Caribbean, but like in Guatemala, 2 or 3 hours late is on time to anything, to like a meeting with your lawyer. And so you can imagine what that does, because we live in a world where it's like, I'm going to see the doctor, and if I'm 10 minutes late, I may miss my appointment. Right. So it ends up just being a quagmire of like awkwardness. And the time thing for me is one thing I still maybe haven't really figured out. But one of the things I'll say is, I said at the beginning of the pod here that when I went back to the States, I was shocked, dude. I had reverse culture shock. And this happens to anyone who's been abroad, whether it's in the Peace Corps, and they told us this was going to happen. Or if you've been abroad overseas and you've been serving in the military, and people come back from the military have different reasons to have culture shock, or what maybe you could call PTSD. But there's a scene in the movie, what's the movie with Jeremy Renner where he's the bomb detective? Do you know what I'm talking about? I think it's that movie. The Hurt Locker. Hurt Locker. Yep. And there's a scene, I believe it's in that movie, and he's walking in a supermarket, and he just stops, and he's in the aisles, and it's like this crazy scene where he's just there. You see the back of him, and he's stopped, and he's just surrounded by like supermarket. That like was kind of how it felt coming back to the States. And one of the things too was that they said, hey, when you leave the Peace Corps and you go home, and like I go home and you and I are going to sit at a bar, they're like, you have 3 lines to tell people what you did. And after that, they're not going to be able to connect. They have no reference point, none. It's like if you told me you went to Mars and you were out there for 2 months and you come to tell me, my curiosity would only extend as far as I could, because I just don't know what you're talking about, bro. Let me actually tell you about like the local NFL team or something, because that's something that's like a reference point for me. So I came back to the States. I basically didn't feel like I wanted to be there. I wanted to get back out to the quote world. And then I went back to Colombia, and then getting to Colombia was completely different. So when I went to Guatemala, I had 3 months of training. And here's a secret that Peace Corps doesn't really want us to probably say out loud, but many people, at least in that time, would join the Peace Corps just for the training. If they wanted to learn French, for example, and they were going to be sent to Francophone Africa, they would join, get through the training, and then quit before they were sent to their sites for the 24 months. Remember the 3 months of training and 24 months of service? So they got 3 months basically of government subsidized language classes, right? So when I went to Guatemala, I had language classes, I had cultural immersion classes, I had all these crazy things to like try to wrap my head around this country, which I'd never been to really honestly show up and be the most correct in rooms with people, to be the most respectful of their culture, and not honestly be the ugly gringo, which unfortunately when Americans travel, we can maybe not be the best of ourselves. And so when I went to Colombia though, because I had already served, I had 4 hours of training. They were like, all right, just this, and this. This is how this is done. If you need to get money out, go here. Da, 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 da. Be careful in the ATMs. ATMs are where scams happen. Da, da, da. We'll send you out to your site tomorrow, and good luck. And that was it. So I had 2 completely different, like, kind of getting into the countries, but both good experience, both culture shock for different reasons. For in Guatemala, it was the time. I think in the coast of Colombia, it was the heat. It's just so hot. And the house I lived in didn't have AC, and it's 110 degrees real heat. And so I tell this story, and I'll tell it on your podcast because I don't mind being TMI here, but it would be so hot, and all I had was a fan. But it's a concrete poured floor. So sometimes I would literally just sleep in my birthday suit on the floor, just spreading my body as far as I could. And sometimes I'd buy bags of water from the local tienda, because they come in like, 600 milliliters in a bag of water. And I'd put that on my wrists and behind my ankles, because if you can cool those spots behind your neck, you can cool your body heat like drastically in a couple of minutes. So anyways, they were different for different reasons. And Colombia is also just on the coast, just moves so much quicker. So it's like I didn't have the time, but now it was so hot, and like, holy gosh, you're like next to the sun. And now I forgot the other questions. So now you gotta tell me the other questions.
Oh, I mean, you kind of already told one of the stories, but
stories.
When you're reflecting on this, what stories are you telling people at the bar or in person when you're reflecting on this?
So I have a lot of stories,
or whatever.
Yeah, so I have a lot of stories, and some of them I'll never tell on mic because they don't need to be told. Some of them are also just tragic, and it's like crazy. And there's a lot of stuff that I never told my parents or friends at home because they have no reference point. And when you hear that something happens like that, you're like, well, within my context, that's crazy. and that's illegal, or that's this. And it's like, no, there's different rules here. There's a whole different understanding of whatever this thing is. So, but one of the things I think back to a lot is I was visiting some volunteers.
And feel free to tell any that you want. Like, I don't know, bad, tragic stories aren't necessarily, I mean, they're worth hearing. So if you want to go that route, go for it.
All right, then I mean, there's some that I'll just never share because God, still don't even know how I process them. But I'll share too. So I'll start with a more tragic story, which is around like ideas of healthcare. There was a woman who had tuberculosis, and tuberculosis is something that doesn't really exist anymore in the States, right? Like, we've nabbed that in the butt. But unfortunately, in certain places, these upper respiratory problems still exist, and people still die of tuberculosis, right? So even though we've eradicated it in the States, it doesn't mean that it's not something that still is a problem around the world. Like, malaria kills, I think, like millions of people every year, So there was a woman, and she was an older woman, and she had basically tuberculosis. And there's medicine now to cure this. Like, we just need to go do this, right? And my site mate, I believe, was engaging with her, and I'd engaged with her a little bit. And we were like, hey, like, we can arrange to get you a car, because she lived walking 9 hours from where she probably needed to go, even just to get up to the road to get a bus to then go to hospital. And I mean, some of the places I worked, if I had broken my ankle, I would have been in trouble, because you're just so far away from like anything. So we had discussed with her, and I actually have created a blog, if you want to put this in the notes, if it's interesting. But I worked in a very religiously influenced place, because the closer you get to extreme poverty, the more religion seems to pop up, for good and for worse, I think. And so she was just like, no, I'm in God's hands. I'm in God's hands. And we're like, great, hey, you can still be in God's hands, but what about owing it to, the rest of your community, your children, your grandkids, why don't we just go see a doctor? Like, can you still be in God's hands, and can we still do that? Or is that going to ruffle feathers? And I remember we kind of went through this, and it was really my site mate who kind of was engaging with her more, just because my site mate was a woman. And there are many places in Guatemala where I, as a man, was not really culturally allowed. In many of the villages where I worked, I never went in the kitchen, because as a man, I was not only not welcome by the women in the kitchen, but I may have lost like my ability to garner respect from the men in the village. That's just not the way it is, due to the dynamics between genders in Guatemala. Now, things may or may not have changed now, but I don't know. The Mayan cultures have been around for 1,000+ years. So she, turns that down, and unfortunately tuberculosis is going to do its thing. And that's just kind of, we never heard word, but we kind of knew. We just never, I think we didn't ask, because we didn't want to hear that. It was so sad that we would turn down Western medicine, and because I think in the United States, you can be both religious and seek Western medicine when you think it's going to probably save your life, right? So I think that was a really tough one for us, because it was like, okay, all right, like that sticks with me, that people are going to do what they're going to do no matter what, based on their beliefs, whether they're religious or not. So that was one. And then one of the ones that I think about and I tell people about was, I was out in the middle of nowhere. I say nowhere, Guatemala, obviously it's somewhere, but it was in Alta Verapaz, which is, as far as the statistics at the time, was one of the poorest places in Guatemala, and Guatemala being one of the poorest places in the region of Americas, North, Central, and South. And we went out to this amazing like hole, and it was filled with rainwater. And it was like from a movie. It looked like from, something James Cameron would have had in Avatar, right? Because it was and it's in the middle of the jungle. It's hot. We go out, and there's cliff diving, where you can climb up this rock wall and then basically jump off. And so there were other kids there, and myself and a couple of volunteers, we went. It was so hot. We were so happy to just jump in the water. So we kind of get in the water, and then we're like, all right, let's get up and let's climb up these rocks. And the thing is, this is a one-way trip. If you've ever done any rock climbing or if you climbed anything, the hard part isn't getting up. It's how you get down within either belaying or jumping, right? Because sometimes it's more dangerous to try to come down, especially if you're not on belay. So it was kind of like, once you got up this thing, there was only one way down, and that was to jump. And there were two different peaks, and I was probably like maybe 40 to 45 feet high, which is high enough that you realize this is high. And I remember I went up, and people were jumping off, and I like wouldn't go, but I was on like the perfect perch. And this kid comes up to me. He doesn't say anything. This was the best conversation I ever had in my life. He doesn't say anything. He basically just kind of like points. And I was like, no, like you go. He also spoke a dialect that I didn't speak because I at that point my Spanish was getting better, but he spoke a Mayan language I didn't speak. So it was a lot of him. There's a lot of there's actually an entire like sign language that kind of exists in Guatemala, just due to the fact that there are 26 Mayan languages that people sometimes come across and they don't speak the language. So anyways, I said, no, you go. And the kid must have been 7, right? And I'm 23, 24, thinking I can run the world. And he just looks at me, is like, all right, runs and goes. And I was like, oh man. To this day, I'll never forget it. I'll never forget it, because it was just like, dude, you just got to jump. You just got to jump. And that kid, I'll never see him again. I couldn't pick him out of the crowd. No idea who he was, but he made me like rethink that, like, whenever you're on the edge or thinking about something, whether it's entrepreneurship or you're going to ask somebody on a date, or it's like, should I go do this thing? It's like, should I get up and go to the gym? Just do it. Like, I know that that's Nike's thing, right? But like, you're only wasting time till execution. So like, go. And that's something that sticks with me for the rest of my life, because this kid didn't say anything to me. We had a conversation non-verbally for 3 seconds, but I had been waiting up there 10 minutes and most people just went up and went. And I had done the cost benefit analysis of trying to get back down, but I had board shorts on and they were wet and they were dripping and I would have had to go feet first. So anyways, that's I have like other stories, but I think that one was the one that was like, dude, you just got to go on whatever it is. And that helped me honestly for the rest of my experience, because there were times where it was just like, what do I do? What do I do? And there's nothing that replaces action. So that was pretty good. Yeah.
I think I've only jumped like 30 feet into cliff jump, so I can't even fathom 45. And then my wife, when we went to Costa Rica, she did this thing called the Tarzan swing, and I walked to the top and said, nope, I'm going right back down the stairs. So that's hung over my head forever. There's actually a video of her doing it on our page that's just hilarious. She screamed the whole way down.
Yeah, but I think that's good though. Deciding whether you're not going to do something, but whatever it is, just do it quickly. Don't dilly-dally. Just make that, like, the quicker you make that decision, I don't know, I just find life to be so much better. So yeah.
The worst part of it was that if you've ever done the power tower at Cedar Point, you're in their hand.
No.
You go to the top and you're just like, when are they gonna hit that button? And that anticipation kills me. If I have to, trick myself to lunge off the cliff, or trick myself to push that power tower button, that's different than like, oh my God, the Tarzan swing. They hung you from a rope and just you sat there until they pulled the pin. And that anticipation just makes my heart want to pound out of my chest. But yeah, I chickened out on that one. That's a cool story though. And I'm I'm religious, so like kind of hearing the tuberculosis thing, I don't know, that strikes me a little bit. It's impressive that people have that much faith and are willing to seek help on stuff.
Yeah, the religious influence of my time in Guatemala was fairly strong. It was fairly strong between evangelicals and between Mormons. They were all basically just trying to get as many to come to their flock as possible. They both have narratives that they're trying to get people to join and buy into, and so it was pretty hefty. I didn't foresee that going into Guatemala, that I was going to be confronted with religion as much as I was, but definitely it was around every corner for sure. Yeah. And
not as good or bad as it sounded when you said you just like plopped into a village. Like, I was thinking of Jehovah's Witnesses, like, or Mormons, right? They do their whatever they call it to go try to convert people. That's just what came to mind. But no, this is great. I appreciate you sharing all this. We kind of talked about this before the show, or before we started hitting record. You kind of took a lot of the stuff that you learned to actually move down to Colombia. You're in Bogota, you said?
Yeah, I'm in Bogota. And so part of my story, which I didn't share, and I'm not sure if some people know, but I was born in Bogota and then I was adopted. And so I was raised in Boston. And so Spanish has always been something I've been like wanting to learn. And so that was another like personal thing of like, I need to go to Guatemala. I need to be living and working and existing in this language. And so that helped a lot. Yeah, for sure.
Did you have a choice to go to Guatemala?
So you don't. What you do is you didn't then. The Peace Corps has evolved greatly. at that point, I mean, this was like when I applied to college, you know, like I had to fill out all these papers, handwritten, my handwriting's horrible, put it in manila envelope, mail it to DC. Then I got an interview where I met up with like, it was like a group interview. I remember we met up at a bar with like the recruiter and he's just asking us questions to get a feel. And then basically they take your skill set, whatever that is, and they try to align that with the region of your choice. That's it. Things have drastically changed now. You can join the Peace Corps, I think, like through an app, and you can fill it out. And you, if you wanted to go, you and your wife could go together. It used to be very difficult to kind of go, not difficult, but there were more roadblocks if you want to go with your spouse or your loved one. Now I've heard you can even go with like a best friend. So you and I are besties, and like we would be better volunteers if we went. And this is one of the things that the Peace Corps realized, and this is why they've changed so much over the years, is that they realize a happy volunteer is a successful volunteer, is one that's going to stay there. Because a lot of people don't make it to 24 months for whatever reason. They have someone at home, a family member dies at home. You know, there's a million reasons that are going to, that life happens, right? And it's 2 years. So now they've changed it. So you can go, you can choose where you're going to go. Like, for example, if you speak French and you want to work in community development, then you should probably go to Francophone Africa or a place in the Caribbean where maybe, you know, they're speaking French, as opposed to them sending you to Brazil or something, right? Where you're gonna have to learn Portuguese or something like that. So they're really trying to match up people's skills more. I think technology has helped with this. Their website is farther, improved. And one of the things I'll say is, because I get to choose a friend, like in the future, one of my retirement plans is to probably do the Peace Corps again. Because they're going to pay for everything. I hopefully get to learn a new language and I get to see a new part of the world. And the healthcare benefits you have when you're in the Peace Corps are top because you're a government employee. So, you know, that's something I try to tell people, that even though you didn't do it in your 20s or your early 30s or whatever, when you were younger, there are more and more people that are doing that as they get older.
Okay. That's cool. I like that. How was transitioning from that to Colombia, Bogota full time?
Yeah. Sorry. So I don't think I answered that. But taking skills that I learned from the Peace Corps, and this is something that we said before we started to record, many of the people who I serve with in the Peace Corps still now live abroad, or they've probably married somebody not from the States, just because they've met abroad or whatever that looks like. And I think that the skills of being someone who you just drop into a country you've never been to before, into a language maybe you've never spoken before, culture you've never done before, in a time zone you didn't even know existed, eating food you didn't even know existed. Once you've kind of done all that, I just think it kind of makes everything else easier. So my transition to Colombia has been fairly easy. I've also been in and out of Colombia since I served in the Peace Corps, which I finished in Colombia in June of 2013. So that was more than a decade ago. And I've been in and out of Colombia, kind of digitally nomading for a while, but now I'm full-time Colombia. And I have been for about the past year.
I think this is a decent transition into the media stuff that we're both doing, but
sure.
I love that you've learned all these skills that, you know enough about yourself that you can figure anything out. And so if you're thrown into the middle of nowhere somewhere, you have the skills to, find a place to live, make friends, meet all the things that you need, all your necessities, and then thrive in that community. And even with work, right? I've been thrown all around this company for 2 years, and it's literally just, scanning the entire company saying, all right, this corner of the business needs help. Let me dive in and figure it out. And I think a lot of people, they really struggle with like decision paralysis. They talk things to death. And often, the best thing you do is start, what's the worst that could happen? Let's try it. And, if the worst thing does happen, is it going to kill me? Probably not. I could probably get through it and be better because of it. So I've always loved the digital nomad stuff. I actually want to have more people on this show to talk about that. What's the other one? It's digital nomad and expats. They don't stay as long, right?
Yeah. So expats are more like, and expats is an interesting word because like there are a lot of people in the Black and brown community that see expat as like a white only American thing. And I don't know how I feel about that, because like we're always all called that, especially by like the embassy. So expat is someone who's definitely just going to like live abroad. Like when you and your wife are like, you know what, let's retire in Costa Rica. That'd be cooler. Digital nomad is definitely someone who's just living out of their backpack because all they need is this. I'm pointing to my computer, and they literally are just looking for the cheapest place to live that has great Wi-Fi, so that way they can lower their expenses for whatever, whether that's because they want to work only 15 hours a week, or whether that's because they want to find financial freedom and retire way before 65 or whatever's prescripted, or because they have a crap ton of student debt and they're trying to pay that down. And if they're living in a 1-bedroom in Brooklyn and it's $2,200 and they can live in Colombia in a beautiful place for $200 a month, they're like, I get to pay off my debt in 80% faster. So yeah. And there's a lot more, and God, we could talk about this in a whole nother episode, but there's digital nomadry, and the idea of living abroad as like a US citizen has absolutely exploded over, like, the pandemic did it. But it was like people going to Portugal, people going to Puerto Rico, people going all over the Americas. Mexico City is overrun with people from the States, which is both good and bad, right? So, but yeah.
I know you said you have to go in like 10 minutes. Do you want to dive into the media stuff, or you want to wrap it up?
Let's dive into the media stuff. So go ahead, pick up that. Let me just make the text. Let me just send one text. You always have to edit this, but
I can crop this out, no problem.
Diego, voy terminando un podcast. Ahora mismo estamos grabando. Entonces llego como a las 3:40, pero si me puedes hacer el favor de adelantar eso, al llegar ahí, pues llego en como 15, 20 minutos. Okay, cool. Let's do it. Yeah, start with the media question.
Yeah, how do I want to say this?
I just finished the digital nomad stuff, so if you want to.
Yeah, so I hinted at this earlier with the whole just start thing, and we didn't talk about this yet, but I was very excited to have you on because you've done multiple podcasts. You do our media for our company, and I'm starting this podcast out just having interesting guests on because I want to talk to them. And it's one of those things where if you listen to my first episode, I think you're my 18th, they're dynamically different, right? I now have an intro and outro. I have music that I play over stuff. I'm starting to look at people that I want to put on as ads. And then just like, I don't know, learning YouTube, Spotify, Instagram, how to engage with people and how you can just literally cold contact people to get them on. It's been totally fascinating. So I'm excited for you to leave this episode and give me pointers, but also I want to hear about some of the media stuff you've done and what you've learned along the ways. We could talk about this off air, but I think we both agreed it would be fun to kind of break the fourth wall and talk about this on air and have people hear about it.
Yeah, and actually, my biggest question for you is, what has been your biggest struggle so far as a podcaster?
Oh my God. See, I feel like I still don't even know exactly what I'm doing. Like the end goal is to monetize, right? I would love to turn this into something, but legitimately I have fun talking with people. And if this fails in a year, I still got to sit down and learn more about the Peace Corps in a one-on-one setting than I would ever. If I'm talking to you at a bar or in a meeting, we're going to get interrupted or derailed. And I don't know, that's been invaluable. So I've struggled to get listens and followers, but I'm getting more and more traction every single day. And that's the fun of it. As an engineer by background, the fun is just taking data, iterating, and getting it better every single time. And I think I'm doing that. So that did not answer your question. I don't know what the struggle's been.
No, it did. It did in many ways. And the struggle for you right now is even finding footing probably, and just figuring out maybe a flow. And I will say that for me, I've been podcasting since the summer of 2020. And before that, I had a couple entrepreneurial ventures, and it was like selling a product, right? You're either selling a product or you're selling a service. However, content is outside of that because you're not really selling anything. People are actually giving you their most valuable resource, which is their time. But I basically started podcasting, and I kind of got into it because I was fascinated by the idea of people's attention and telling stories. And I think you're also fascinated by the storytelling side, which is like, this is really cool. And as we spoke to off mic, I've now had, between all my podcasts and with the podcast, maybe I'll shout out here, which is More Than Blockchain, I've had guests on from every continent. And we've talked about things that I never would have imagined. And the one thing, and I'll say this, and you hinted at it, this is the reason why I have the podcast, the reason why I started it, because I wanted to be able to get in rooms that I wasn't invited into. I wanted to muscle into rooms I couldn't have normally got into. The second you have a podcast and you have a certain amount of episodes, you can kind of write anyone on the internet, and who cares if they say no, because that doesn't change. They weren't going to come on your podcast until you ask. And if they say no, it's okay. And then maybe they get to do a podcast. So I actually have a guest on tomorrow. His name's Jonathan Schultz. He's a huge artist, like a big time Web 2 artist, but he's blowing up in Web 3. And like, to give you an idea of how big he is in Web 2, he was recently doing a collaboration and was selling paintings to a large amount of the staff from Ted Lasso. Like, he's a massive deal. And where I was maybe in a year ago, I probably wouldn't have even felt comfortable asking his type of a caliber of someone who's doing that type of artwork in Web3. And now he's doing ordinals, because I didn't feel like I had the fertile ground yet. You know, like I couldn't have sustained what I think he's going to bring to my user base and the story he's going to tell. And maybe I also wouldn't have felt empowered, me personally, to be able to interview him. You know, interviewing is a skill that takes years and years, and it just like gets better, like a snowball going downhill. And so being able to hit him up and then he say yes is like awesome. Now, I had a mutual friend who I think maybe helped out, but I have one of his ordinals. So I'm like kind of cheesing that I get to have him on my podcast. And so I do think at the end of the day, that's like one of the coolest things. And that's where, like you said, even if my podcast ends or your podcast ends tomorrow, you've still been able to have conversations with people that they probably wouldn't have given you the time of day for. So that's like, it's kind of a cheat code. And now we're saying it out loud.
The other thing is, like, people like to tell their stories and they're not often given the chance to do it. I mean, even in the relationship with my wife and I, she's a talker, I'm a listener. So I like to bring people on and just sit back and listen. And some of the people that we've had on has just been so interesting. Like, and same deal. Some people who said yes, I'm like, fuck yeah. Like, I had these twins on, these twin girls that have done the Iditarod like 42 times, dog sled racing. And I was just like, I never thought I'd get to talk about dog sled racing. Just tell me your stories. This is fantastic. And yeah, every single episode I leave, I hit end record. I get to banter with you for a second, and I'm just cheesing for the rest of the day because, I don't know, it just perks me up. I will say I'm never excited to start it. I'm just like, oh, I want to sit on the couch. But then I hit record, I get into it, and it makes me so happy to like force myself out of that comfort zone and talk to a stranger. So
that's actually super cool. It's super cool that you feel that way about it, because there are days when I don't want to do it either, but I've just scheduled it. And I'm like, well, all right, we got to do this. And I wanted to say something else about like creating media that, you know, you've asked me to give you tips. And, you know, you and I could talk about pointers and tips and best practices now. The crazy thing is the way the internet and the way tech moves, they're not even going to be valuable in 3 to 6 months. With a guy, we had a soccer podcast. We covered the English Premier League, and we did it for 3 seasons of the Prem, which is a long time, 38 games a season. There's just so much going on.
I have to ask, did that interest start because of your time in Colombia?
No,
I played soccer in Colombia and started a soccer podcast.
No, I played college soccer. I've been playing soccer since I was a kid. I've been watching the English Premier League for 22 years now, 21 years. So when the pandemic happened, my buddy and I, shout out Jeff, we started a podcast. And that was kind of like my introduction to podcasting. We started together, and then I had my own, which eventually I rebranded into More Than Blockchain to talk just basically about crypto, Bitcoin, blockchain, and now AI, adding in AI. But when we started it, we were like in the throes of the NFTs and the metaverse. So one of the things we wanted to do, and I still want to do this, I just don't have the gumption, is to have our podcast in Oculus. So that way people could also come into the room. They can't talk, but they could like be with us in a virtual environment. And I really do think the future of content creation and storytelling is totally in a virtual environment. For the work you and I do, and I don't really want to talk about our work because that's not why we're here, but I could see a situation in the future where we have content where people can join us through XR, right, which is AR, VR, and MR. And if you don't know those differences, follow More Than Blockchain. And you could go through one of our facilities or check out our services or interact with us without actually having to be physically in the same place, but virtually we could be in the same place. So that's truthfully where I think the future of all this is going. And like the Apple Vision Pro is just a step in that. Podcasting in the 90s or whenever it started was just audio, because all podcasting is really a radio station. But then people were like, oh, let's throw it up on YouTube and really grow brand and start getting paid from the algorithm and all that. But I do think the next step, as we replace these bad Larrys, here's my US and my Colombian, as we replace these bad Larrys, we're going to have goggles on. So I could see a thing where I come on High Quality Fun in 5 to 10 years and you and I are just in a virtual space. So anyways, it's tough to like even talk about what is podcasting today, because I feel like it's constantly evolving. So yeah.
I'll even say the targeted ads I'm getting on Instagram are just, oh my God, this AI can help you with this. This AI can help you with this. Make your first funnel, learn about this. And,
yeah,
as I'm just iterating, I'm okay. Today I'm going to research this. Today I'm going to research affiliate marketing. It's been so fun. I really am enjoying it. But
sweet.
Yeah, I think that's great. I'm glad we went off on that tangent a little bit. It's cool to kind of hear how long you've been doing this for. I know it's been a while, but yeah, Jarrett, thank you so much for coming on. Thanks for telling our listeners about the Peace Corps. I enjoyed it. I learned a lot. Did not expect a lot of that. Yeah, I hope you have a good day.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Thank you for listening to the High Quality Fun podcast. If you guys enjoyed this show, please give us a follow. And if you have a good story or just want to say hi, feel free to reach out to us on Instagram or YouTube. Thanks for listening.